Hey guys, Spirit of the Law here. In this video, I want to talk about the sometimes controversial unique tech Flemish Revolution. It's a one-time use for Burgundians that turns all of their villagers into Flemish Militia, replacing your entire economy with army. It's a pretty strong unit as well, comparable to a champion, but with extra bonus damage against cavalry, and of course, it usually comes in overwhelming numbers. Generally, the tech is seen as a completely all-in move that can help you finish an opponent to quickly end the game. On the other hand, if it fails, you're in a pretty difficult position trying to reboom from scratch. It's a mechanic that's actually appeared before in both Age of Mythology and Age of Empires 3. For this video though, I want to look into the tech's true hidden cost. Superficially, it's 800 food and 450 gold, or 1200 food and 650 gold as of the next patch. So with 100 villagers, it seems like you're getting each Flemish Militia for an 80 to 85% discount. Now while they may appear very cheap from that perspective, that's just scratching the surface of what you're really spending. Let's say you don't seal a victory with your big push and want to try to reboom. How far behind are you economically? There's several hidden costs to consider, like the cost of having to create all of your villagers from scratch at 50 food each, and there's also the lost resources that aren't being gathered while you reboom. The goal here is to put all of that together and find out exactly how much each of those individual Flemish Militia cost. I want to start with a basic foundational question though, of whether your villagers drop off the resources they're carrying, or if what they're carrying completely disappears. It turns out they give you whatever they're carrying at the moment the tech finishes, so we don't need to worry about factoring that in. With handcart, that really could have added up to a lot. Also, any villagers that are already queued come out as villagers, which you can maybe use to start the reboom a few seconds earlier, but isn't something major we need to account for. With that out of the way, let's try a concrete example of a situation you might get the tech and how much you're paying for each militia, though I will be playing around with the numbers after to try some different situations. I'll assume we're at 120 villagers, as that's fairly standard for a fully developed economy, and then we use Flemish Revolution and reboom back to 120 villagers again. If we start with a simple model, here's a graph of the number of villagers on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. For someone who just left their 120 villagers working and didn't use the tech, it would look like this. The area under the graph is length times width, so following the units, that means the area is in villager seconds. That's just another way to talk about villager work, and using gather rates, this can be easily converted into a corresponding amount of any resource. These are the rates that I'm going to be using for that conversion, and for example, 1000 villager seconds of farming is equivalent to 400 food, so I'll be talking about villager seconds and resources somewhat interchangeably. Jumping back to the graph, let's see what it looks like for someone who just used Flemish Revolution and is therefore resetting from scratch. 25 seconds later, they'll create 3, 4, or 5 new villagers depending on their number of town centers, and that's going to repeat until they're back up to their target of 120. How quickly that happens depends on the number of town centers, but for this basic example, we'll say you have 5. The graph is somewhat simplified, but notice we get a stepping pattern, and in this case, it would take about 10 minutes to get your eco back up to full strength. We can simplify things a bit by drawing a straight line through the middle of each step, and it gives us a triangle, which is much easier to work with. There's a slight correction that has to be made because it doesn't start at exactly 0, but that's pretty easy to account for. Remember, the area below the line tells us the resources collected in villager seconds, so the area between the lines is the resources we're missing out on by having to reboom from scratch. Interestingly, there's a pretty clean relationship in that the opportunity cost is almost exactly half the resources we would have otherwise had. But now we need to think about the cost of paying for all those new villagers, and at 50 food each, given Imperial Age farming rates, that number comes out to about 15,000 villager seconds. In more familiar terms, that's what you gather from 50 farmers working for 5 minutes. Then there's the upfront cost of the technology itself, which again we can convert to villager seconds using Imperial Age collection rates. Adding it all up, with 5 town centers rebooming to 120 villagers, we have the total cost of Flemish Revolution in villager work time is around 55,000 villager seconds. Using an average collection rate in Imperial Age, that comes out to a cost of a little over 25,000 resources. That's a little bit more than advertised, and makes it by far the most expensive unique tech in the game, actually comparable to getting spies, though in this case it's mostly at the cost of food and wood instead of just gold, and you don't need to pay all of it up front. Taking that information, it turns out that each of those 120 Flemish Militia you thought were costing 8 food and 4.5 gold could actually be costing you something more like 213 resources by the time you finish rebooming. Even with the proposed increase to Flemish Revolution, that's only going to change to 219. That's a pretty steep cost, and while you don't feel that full cost in the moment, you can see why you really do need to end the game quickly, or at least cause a lot of damage to your opponent. What's really happening is you're borrowing from your future economy to pay around 2.5 times the Flemish Militia's standard cost, which is fine if you can end the game in one big push and avoid feeling that full impact, but long term, if the game does continue, you really overpaid for those units. In some ways, this is optimistic as well, as it assumes no hiccups in your reboom and that you take no additional economic damage from raids while you're rebuilding. Then again, you'll undoubtedly inflict some damage on your opponent's economy as well. But now that we have the basic model, is there anything we can do to tweak it and increase the militia's value? What if instead of 120 villagers, we overboom up to 200, use our unique tech, and reboom back to the normal 120? The cost of the tech and the reboom is the same, but averaged over 200 units, it comes out to a slightly more reasonable 151 resources per Flemish Militia. This is including the cost of the 80 extra villagers though, and if we assume they've already paid for themselves, then it comes out to a bit better 131 resources per militia. It's definitely better, but that's still 1.5 times the cost of recruiting 200 Flemish Militia at their standard price. It's notable that even with 200 units, we're still not getting a discount once you factor in the full economic reboom. If only there was some way to bring the cost of the technology down. It turns out there's a way. We can't do anything about the price of the tech or the villagers per se, but about 2/3 of the total cost is a result of how long it takes to reboom. If we can speed it up by building additional town centers, that indirectly lowers the tech's long-term impact. So far, I've assumed we have just 5 town centers, but what if you know this is coming ahead of time and instead build 10? Theoretically, that gets your economy back to full strength in half the time. One wrinkle though is town centers also have their own cost, so that'll need to be accounted for as well. It turns out with 10 town centers and 200 villagers, we can get the cost per Flemish Militia down from 131 to 98 resources each. That's still around a 15% premium compared to their 85 resource cost to hard build, but we are getting closer. It worked the first time, so let's just make even more town centers, and that should make them even cheaper. Unfortunately, that's not quite how it works. It turns out making too many town centers actually hurts your economy, since those additional town centers have their own cost to consider. Going from 10 to 30 town centers with the same 200 villager example, the cost per militia actually goes up. The sweet spot, it turns out, is 16 town centers. That gives the best trade-off between speeding up your reboom and not over-investing in TCs. Now, does that mean you always have to boom to 200 villagers to justify using the tech? I hope it's obvious that's not what I'm suggesting. In practice, it's mostly used to quickly end a game when you already have an advantage, or as a final desperation move when things are spiraling out of control. Oftentimes, it will simply end the game one way or the other, and a complete reboom afterwards feels more like the exception rather than the rule. These are all just meant to be some factors to keep in mind. Now, it does bring up the question of whether or not this tech is overpowered. Flemish Militia are certainly a strong unit, but I like that there wasn't a way I could find to end up getting them at a discount. While looking at the short term and just the tech's cost, you could say it gives you nearly free units. I think that's a bit misleading way to think about the tech. There is a long-term trade-off there, and you're always going to be overpaying for them, at least if you accept their individual creation cost of 60 food and 25 gold. It's somewhat telling that the Burgundians' late game is completely average, and even breaking it down by different elos, keeping some small sample sizes in mind, at no level does it appear to be an automatic late game win. A couple of tips when actually using the technology are first of all to try to make sure you have some extra town centers and at least 1,000 or more food left over. It's relatively cheap to reboom as your farms and infrastructure stick around, but if you start off with no food, then you'd better be 100% committed to winning with your existing army. So that's Flemish Revolution and what I'd call its true long-term cost in some different situations. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.